it's me again. Amy Reese, I'm going to discuss our collection of 3D rock models and how we're using them as teaching and learning objects. This project actually predates me on the UAB campus. One of our geology professors, Dr. Scott Brandy, secured a rather large NSF grant to enhance the teaching of rock identification. His original goal was to create, 40 3D rock models that students could use to learn geology in remote learning environments. In 2024, he was nearing the end of the grant and wanted to hand his models off to the university, and that's when he connected with me. Our repository had launched not too far in the past at the end of 2022, and we were hoping to provide solutions for this type of non-traditional content. We initially engaged in a lot of discussion about expectations, since those would deeply affect our approach. We started off with a test collection in the sandbox just to see how everything would need to work. If this was going to function as a teaching collection, it couldn't just be a collection of downloadable items. The collections also needed to be dynamic and interactive. We quickly came to the realization that we needed to rely on dual hosting to achieve that. The Sketchfab component of the hosting was to assure that the items were manipulatable so that the students could turn them around and see all sides of the rocks and have a good understanding of what textures were involved. The DC hosting was to assure that we had archivable copies available in case the Sketchfab account ever had to go away. Dr. Brandy had elaborated to ensure that I understood his vision for how the rocks would operate with the students, and how they might use the models for as learning objects. His goal, since it was since his funding was based on the rocks being a teaching collection, ultimately his goals were to make the collection permanent, that these models would be created for the geosciences community, not just on our campus, but across academia. And it would serve as a bit of a legacy for his work. Dr. Brandy was nearing retirement and wanted to sunset all of his personal third-party accounts that he had set up while he was in the process of the grant. And the models were to teach students about rocks, the types, the names, the physical characteristics. And this was added kind of at the end, that the models would need to also quiz students on the same information while safeguarding against cheating as much as possible. We set up the Sketchfab account for our repository to ensure availability and captured the bulk of the models from Dr. Brandy's account. And we used those models as samples in our sandbox. It turned out that a number of those original items were collected from other creators, so ultimately they didn't meet our criteria for repository inclusion. To set up the collection, the models needed to have the same UX as they did in Sketchfab. Our DC consultant set up Embedly on our sandbox series. At the time, Sketchfab wasn't an official Embedly provider, but the URL worked for streaming in the Sketchfab viewer content anyway. That allowed us to make the rock models manipulatable for the users so that they could turn them around. And users can replicate how they might interact with physical rocks. We did do a bit of experimentation with different types of series, just to see which type would serve the content the best. We ended up going with a book series for the hosting of our models. The book series gave us a bit more flexibility to depend on the visual elements of the models. This allowed us to use the model images for the book covers, and those were the pics that populate the list view for a more visual browsing. When we started, I wasn't sure how much metadata we would need or how much I would even end up receiving. But I did know that the content would be structured from the 4 categories of conglomerate, igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. The items went into a single series that would later be sorted into separate type series by the metadata whenever the metadata came through to us. And for that, we used the collection tool. It did take a long time for Scott to get me the metadata, and it took such a long time that I feared the collection would never be completed. It was at this point that I'd considered making the models available without metadata, even though it would be less useful. But even without metadata, it would be a fun collection. The idea of quizzing was actually shared late in the process. For this, Scott Brandy had initially wanted Digital Commons to host the quizzing copies, while Sketchfab would host the teaching copies, and the full metadata would be in Sketchfab. That would have been fine, except for the unavoidable direct link to Sketchfab via the Embedly window. We didn't want to provide the students with the answers for the quizzes too easily, so we were forced to flip the approach. The Sketchfab ended up being for the quizzing and Digital Commons for the teaching. This meant Digital Commons would have the full metadata, and that Sketchfab would have all the metadata stripped out. Having it set up this way means our Sketchfab models aren't very discoverable. But our Digital Commons copies can be discovered easily through the Commons. Especially since we assigned a custom material type of 3D model, which in the Unified Commons shows up under the other category. This slide is a lot of text, and I'm not going to go through it. And it's just there to help you in case you want to set up a collection like this on your own. I did want to talk, though, about the teaching and the quizzing part a little bit more. For the students to access the rock models from the LMS, they will engage in their traditional online instruction. They'll then be directed to the models in Digital Commons where they can handle the models and see the basic metadata that is supplemented by whatever instructional content is available through the LMS. Students can visit the Sketchfab models, but they don't need to. The only reason they might is to get a bigger view of the rocks. But again, in Digital Commons with the Embedly window, they're getting the full experience. For the quizzing part, students access the quiz through their LMS and are linked directly to the models in question in Sketchfab so that they will answer their quiz questions. The reason this works is because there's no metadata in the Sketchfab, they take what they've learned about the models previously and answer their questions in the LMS. Cheating can never be eliminated, especially in remote learning environments. We probably could have taken it a little further and changed the model numbers between Digital Commons and Sketchfab, but we didn't feel like that would significantly change the student outcomes. This is what we ended up with. In Sketchfab, we created a collection for each of the 3D model series that we have. And in our rock model collection, the Sketchfab model numbers correspond to the same models in Digital Commons. The effectiveness of our setup relies on the Sketchfab model viewer inside of Digital Commons. That's achieved via Embedly. That's a kind of a full item view there. Without the ability to stream, we'd have to rely on static information, just the images, item metadata, and external links. With the viewer, the collection is definitely more engaging, and we likely wouldn't be able to support the quizzing component without the interactivity. With the series, we really wanted users to lean into the visual browsing. Being set up in a book series and defaulting to the grid view, we were able to facilitate this. We had the bonus of emulating the appearance of a traditional rock box. We set this up as a separate series for the rock types and used the DC collection tool to populate them by way of a keyword filter. Those additional collections provided the structure needed to be effective for both teaching and learning. On our campus, we have been using this collection as a sample to try and encourage more 3D model submissions. But being heavily biomedical, our researchers and students are seeking to capitalize on their work and are often seeking patents, so they really aren't that willing to share.